Box 5.3, Not So Fast, Critical Thinking About the Fundamental Attribution Error. Recent hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria caused tremendous damage, but the most deadly hurricane occurred in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina devastated the city of New Orleans. People across the United States and around the world were surprised that thousands of residents stayed in the city rather than evacuate, costing the lives of nearly 1,500 of them and leading to a harrowing several days for many more. Why would so many people have stayed and risked their lives rather than evacuate, as they were told to do by numerous authorities and media sources? Viewers were puzzled because they thought of staying as choosing to stay. As Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff put it, officials called for a mandatory evacuation. Some people chose not to obey that order. That was a mistake on their part. Michael D. Brown, head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, at the time, who ended up losing his job as a result of his handling of the federal response to the hurricane, echoed the same sentiment when he stated that a lot of people chose not to leave. But how many really chose to stay? It's not hard to detect the influence of the fundamental attribution error here when we consider that those who stayed behind were poorer, probably didn't own a car, had minimal access to news, and had weaker social networks and therefore less opportunity to discuss the situation and how to deal with it. If you don't have a car to get out of the city, don't have the money to pay for lodging wherever you flee, and are less likely to hear about the gravity of the threat from friends, family, or the media, you might very well end up, as they did, staying put and sticking it out. The influence of the fundamental attribution error is even more obvious in the results of a survey that asked relief workers from around the country, doctors, counselors, firefighters, police officers, to provide 3 words to describe those who evacuated in advance of the hurricane and those who stayed behind. Those who left were most often described as intelligent, responsible, and self-reliant, whereas those who stayed behind were described as foolish, stubborn, and lazy. 2009. Being taken in by the fundamental attribution error is easy to do here, because the raw facts are that some people left and some stayed, and the fortunes of those who left tended to be much better than those of the people who stayed behind. The dispositional explanations come easily when it's just those facts that command our attention. It takes some effort to look further and see the background influences that made it so much easier for some people to evacuate than others. There's a general lesson from the Katrina tragedy and our mistaken causal attributions for the deaths of so many. We shouldn't be so fast to make dispositional attributions for others' behavior. We should hold off until we've made a serious attempt to assess the situation confronting them. The fundamental attribution error and Hurricane Katrina. Some people had ready means of escape from Katrina and some did not. Commenters typically ignored such differences when explaining the choice to evacuate in advance of the hurricane's arrival. So in one picture you can see the cars lined up to evacuate, and in one picture you can see someone sitting on their roof, waiting it out. Perceptual salience and causal attributions. In assessing someone's behavior, what influences whether a potential cause springs to mind? One important determinant is how much the cause stands out perceptually, or how salient it is. Features of the environment that more readily capture our attention are more likely to be seen as potential causes of an observed effect, and because people are so noticeable and interesting, they tend to capture our attention much more readily than other aspects of the environment. Situations, if attended to at all, may be seen as mere background to the person and his or her actions. This is particularly true of various social determinants of a person's behavior, customs, social norms, that are largely invisible. Attributions to the person, then, have an edge over situational attributions in everyday causal analysis because people are usually more salient than situations. The importance of perceptual salience in our causal attributions has been demonstrated in many ways. In one study, participants watched a videotape of a conversation between 2 people, 1975. Some participants saw a version that showed only one of the individuals. Others saw a version that showed both people equally well. When the participants assigned responsibility for setting the tone of the conversation, those who could see only one person assigned more responsibility to that individual. than those who could see both people in the conversation equally well. Attribution and cognition. Perceptual salience explains some instances of the fundamental attribution error better than others. It explains the results of the quiz show study, for example, because the decisive situational influence that the questioner could avoid areas of ignorance but the contestant could not was invisible and therefore had little impact on people's judgments. But what about the studies in which participants directed another person to give a particular answer, and then went ahead and assumed that the person's true nature had been revealed by that answer? Here the situational constraints were far from invisible. Why didn't the participants discount appropriately, decide that the person's answer was perfectly well accounted for by the situational constraint of being assigned to give that answer, and thus refrain from making any inference about the person at all? The answer is that the cognitive machinery people draw on when using the discounting principle doesn't work that way. Research by Dan Gilbert, 1989, 2002, makes it clear that we make attributions for people's behavior in a way that stacks the deck in favor of the fundamental attribution error. Gilbert argues that when we observe someone's behavior, we automatically characterize the person as having a disposition corresponding to the behavior observed. Someone doing something kind is instinctively thought of as kind. Someone doing something cruel is reflexively thought of as cruel. The representativeness heuristic discussed in the previous chapter does this work for us. Only on reflection do we consider the context of the behavior, and it's often too little and too late. Our assumption that the behavior is dispositional rather than situational has been made, and revising it is effortful and therefore typically insufficient. Indeed, sometimes an adjustment to consider the context is neglected altogether. In short, the situation is secondary and often slighted in the process as we attempt to establish a causal explanation. Ample evidence supports Gilbert's contention that we rapidly and automatically characterize other people based on their behavior. Then, only later do we consciously ponder what we know about the prevailing situational constraints and adjust our initial dispositional inference if it seems warranted. This analysis suggests that when we are tired, unmotivated, or distracted, we should be more likely to commit the fundamental attribution error or to make a larger error because the adjustment process that considers the situational context is shortened or skipped. In one study that supports this analysis, participants watched a videotape without the sound of a young woman engaged in a conversation with another person. The woman appeared anxious throughout. She bit her nails, twirled her hair, tapped her fingers, and shifted in her chair from cheek to cheek. 1989. Gilbert told half the participants that the woman was responding to a number of anxiety-inducing questions about her sexual fantasies or personal failings, for example. He told the other participants that she was responding to questions about innocuous topics, world travel or great books, for example. Gilbert predicted that all participants, regardless of what they were told about the content of the discussion, would immediately and automatically assume that she was an anxious person. Those told she was discussing anxiety-producing topics, however, would take that into account and adjust their initial characterization, concluding that maybe she was not such an anxious person after all. Those told she was discussing a series of bland topics would not make such an adjustment and would not conclude that she was an anxious person. So far, this is just a standard attribution experiment, but Gilbert added a twist. He gave another two groups of participants the same information he gave the first two, but he had these groups memorize a list of words while watching the videotape. Gilbert reasoned that this extra demand on their attention would make them less able to carry out the deliberative stage of the attribution process in which they would ordinarily adjust their initial characterization of the person to account for situational constraints. If so, then those who thought the woman was discussing anxiety-provoking topics should nevertheless rate her as being just as anxious as those who were told she was discussing innocuous topics. As Figure 5.3 indicates, that's just what happened. When participants were busy memorizing a list of words, They didn't have the cognitive resources needed to adjust their initial impression, so they rated the woman as being just as anxious when they thought she was discussing anxiety-provoking topics as when discussing innocuous topics. This demonstration is important because many things in life may rob us of the cognitive resources needed to carry out the correct phase of attributional analysis in which we take into account situational constraints. 2004. Figure 5.3, Adjusting Automatic Characterizations. Observers had to judge how generally anxious a person was who appeared anxious while discussing either innocuous or anxiety-provoking topics. 1989. Okay, it's a side-by-side bar graph, and the x-axis is participants were, and then the categories are not busy or busy. And on the y-axis is dispositional anxiety from 0 to 12. And the two sets of bars are innocuous topics and anxiety-provoking questions. So you can see that observers who were kept busy by having to memorize a list of words did not correct their initial automatic impression that the person was dispositionally anxious and did not take into account the nature of the material being discussed. Okay, so when the participants were focused and they weren't multitasking, they could see that if the participant seemed anxious about innocuous topics, they had dispositional anxiety, but the people who were not busy, who understood that she was experiencing anxiety-provoking questions, they lowered their sense of her dispositional anxiety, taking external factors into account. But when participants were busy, people, even if they knew that she was experiencing anxiety-provoking questions, rated her dispositional anxiety the same as if they thought she was only fielding innocuous topics because they were multitasking, so they didn't have the cognitive capacity to revise their view of her based on situational constraints. The influence of perceptual salience on causal attributions. People who are more salient, bigger, more brightly lit, more distinctively dressed, are typically seen as more influential in outcomes. Consequences of the fundamental attribution error. Does it matter that we're susceptible to the fundamental attribution error? Indeed it does. We make the error many times a day, and the results can be unfortunate. Here's just one example. People, including employers and college admissions officers, often assume they can learn a lot about a person's traits and abilities from a 30-minute unstructured interview. But interviews reveal only the person's apparent traits and abilities in a single situation. In fact, the validity of the unstructured interview is close to nil. The correlation between judgments based on interviews and the subsequent judgments based on performance on the job or in school is only 0.1. 1984. A more accurate prediction of future performance would require information based on a wide variety of situations. Letters summarizing experience with the candidate in a range of situations, reports of previous job performance, high school GPA, which in turn is based on performance in everything from labs to homework to writing assignments and exams. Such information is far from infallible, but it often predicts future behavior with reasonable accuracy. Correlations between these types of input information and later outcomes are typically much higher than for interviews, on the order of 0.3 to 0.5. Relying on one or two interviews is a setup for disappointment. Employees are hired and students admitted who aren't as terrific as initially thought, and more deserving people are passed up. If the fundamental attribution error is so pervasive and consequential, why are we so susceptible to it and so unaware of it? For one thing, we're not very good at assessing the validity of our own judgments. We can explain after the fact almost any failure of prediction, and we do it so effectively that we're prevented from seeing our errors. Suppose, for example, you were the interviewer who hired Jane, who didn't work out very well. True, but she had some personal problems that came up shortly after she was hired, or Jane's boss was the real problem. It would be hard for anyone working for her to be successful. Choosing Jane automatically prevented you from finding out that other candidates for that job might have been more satisfactory. A second reason for the pervasiveness of the fundamental attribution error is that we often see a given individual only in particular kinds of situations. You see Rachel only at parties, when she seems nice and fun to be around, but you don't know about the trials she inflicts on her roommates. You see Professor Jones only in his statistics classroom, where he seems stiff and boring and none too pleasant, but you don't see him being kind, funny, and helpful with his student advisees, let alone with his kids. Such errors sometimes cause no harm, but sometimes they do, and it's difficult to trace the error back to the fact that dispositional inferences were formed on the basis of limited or biased information. The fallibility of interviews. We tend to assume far more accuracy and utility for interviews than is really the case. The 30-minute interview for college, medical school, executive positions, the Peace Corps, and so on has almost no predictive validity. The actor-observer difference in causal attributions. It may have occurred to you that the degree to which you're oriented toward the person versus the situation depends on whether you're engaged in the action yourself or just observing someone else. In the role of actor, you're usually more interested in determining what kind of situation you're dealing with than assessing what kind of person you are. In the role of observer, in contrast, you're often primarily interested in determining what kind of person you're dealing with. By this logic, actors should be more likely than observers to make situational attributions for a particular behavior, to see their own behavior as caused by the situation, when observers of the very same behavior are more likely to focus on the actor's dispositions. Indeed, there's considerable evidence for just such a difference. In one of the most straightforward demonstrations of this actor-observer difference in attribution, participants had to explain why they chose the college major they did, or why their best friends chose the major that they did. When the investigators scored the participants' explanations, they found that participants more often referred to characteristics of the person when explaining someone else's choice than they did when explaining their own choice. They typically focused on the specifics of the major when explaining their own choice. You might attribute your own decision to major in psychology, for instance, to the fact that the material is fascinating, the textbook's beautifully written, and the professor's dynamic and accessible. In contrast, you might attribute your friend's decision to major in psychology to issues he needs to work out. 1973. Actor-observer difference, a difference in attribution based on who is making the causal assessment, the actor, who is relatively inclined to make situational attributions, or the observer, who is relatively inclined to make dispositional attributions. This phenomenon has significant implications for human conflict, both between individuals and between nations. Married couples, for example, often squabble over attributional differences. John may blame a late meeting or unusually heavy traffic to explain why an errand didn't get done, whereas his husband may be more inclined to argue that he's lazy, inattentive, or just doesn't care. Similarly, at the national level, the United States is likely to explain the stationing of its troops in so many locations across the globe as a necessary defense against immediate and future threats. Other countries may be more inclined to see it as a manifestation of U.S. imperialism. Like the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer difference has no single cause. Several factors give rise to it. First, assumptions about what needs explaining can vary for actors and observers. When asked, "Why did you choose the particular college that you did?" you, here the actor who chose a particular college, might reasonably interpret the question to mean, considering you are who you are, why did you choose the particular college that you did? The person you is taken as a given and therefore need not be included as part of the explanation. This is much like Willie Sutton's explanation of why he robbed banks, because that's where the money is. He takes it as a given that he's a crook and thus interprets the question as one about why he robs banks rather than gas stations. Notice in contrast that when you're asked about someone else and are hence the observer, why did your roommate choose his particular college? The nature of the person can't be taken as a given, so it's reasonable to invoke the roommate's dispositions in offering an explanation. Second, the perceptual salience of the actor and the surrounding situation is different for the actor and the observer. Because, as we noted earlier, people tend to make attributions to potential causes that stand out, are perceptually salient, It makes sense that actors tend to attribute their behavior to the situation, while observers tend to attribute the same behavior to the actor. Third, actors and observers differ in the amount and kind of information they have about the actor and the actor's behavior. Actors know what intentions influence them to behave in a certain way. Observers can only guess at those intentions. Actors are also much more likely to know whether a particular action is typical of them or not. In the attribution language used earlier, the actor is in a much better position to know if the behavior is distinctive, and thus merits a situational rather than a dispositional attribution. Looking back, our attributions are subject to predictable errors and biases. We often exhibit a self-serving attributional bias, attributing success to the self and failure to the situation. We exhibit the fundamental attribution error when we attribute behavior to a person's dispositions rather than the situation, even when there are powerful situational factors that we ought to consider. Actors are more likely than observers to attribute behavior to the situation, whereas observers are more likely than actors to attribute behavior to the actor's dispositions. Culture and causal attribution. Much of what psychologists know about how people understand the behavior of others is undoubtedly universal. People everywhere are likely to engage in counterfactual thinking, imagining outcomes that might have occurred as an aid in understanding what did happen. People everywhere probably prefer to maintain the view that they live in a just world. All people undoubtedly perceive the causes of their own behavior somewhat differently than they perceive the causes of other people's behavior. But there are also some basic differences in how people from different cultures understand the causes of behavior. Some of these differences can be anticipated on the basis of what has been discussed already about cultural differences in perception and in characteristic social relations. Cultural differences in attending to context. Most of the world's people tend to pay more attention to social situations and the people who are involved in them than Westerners do. The kinds of social factors that are merely background for North Americans appear to be more salient to people from other cultures. 2000. Recall from chapters 1 and 3 that Westerners generally define themselves in terms of their relationships with others less often than other people throughout the world do. Westerners think about themselves more in the context of personal goals, attributes, and preferences, whereas non-Westerners think about themselves more in terms of the social roles they occupy and their obligations to other people and institutions. Non-Westerners, therefore, have to pay more attention to others and to the details of the situations they find themselves in, because effective action typically requires coordinating their actions with those of other people. Asians and Westerners do indeed differ in how much attention they give to context, even when perceiving inanimate objects. Kitayama, Duffy, Kawamura, and Larson, 2002, demonstrated this difference in a study with Japanese and American participants, figure 5.4. After examining a square with a line drawn at the bottom, the participants went to another part of the room and saw a square of a different size. They had to draw either a line of the same length as the original or a line having the same length in relation to the original square. The Americans were better at the absolute judgment, which required ignoring the context, whereas the Japanese were better at the relative judgment, which required paying attention to the context. Hedden and his colleagues used functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to examine activation of the frontoparietal area of the brain, which is associated with difficult perceptual judgments. There was more activity in that region when participants had to do the task that did not come as naturally to them. For East Asians, when they made judgments about absolute line length and thus had to ignore the context, and for Westerners when they made proportional judgments and thus had to attend to the context. Figure 5.4. Sensitivity to context and the framed line task. After seeing the target stimulus, participants were asked to draw a vertical line at the bottom of an empty square. In the relative task, the line must be drawn in the same proportion to the square as it was originally. In the absolute task, the new line must be exactly the same length as the original line. Japanese participants performed better at the relative task, and Americans performed better at the absolute task. Okay, so you can see the target stimulus is a box with a line at the bottom, and the relative task involves taking squares of different sizes and drawing a line that's proportional, and the absolute task requires taking different squares and drawing a line that was exactly the same size as the target stimulus when the squares are different sizes. Causal attribution for independent and interdependent peoples. Given the pronounced difference between Asians and Westerners' attention to context, it should come as no surprise to learn that Asians are more inclined than Westerners to attribute an actor's behavior to the situation rather than to the person's dispositions. For example, attributions for the outcomes of sports events are not the same in independent cultures as they are in interdependent cultures. Coaches and players on sports teams in the United States tend to see positive outcomes as the result of the abilities of individual players and the actions of coaches. We've got a very good keeper in Bo Ashania, who was defensive MVP of the finals last year, 1980. In contrast, the attributions of Hong Kong coaches and players are more likely to refer to the other team and the context. I guess South China was a bit tired after having played in a quadrangular tournament, 1996. Cultural differences in attribution. Attributions of Western reporters for outcomes of sporting events tend to emphasize the traits and abilities of individual players. Attributions of East Asian reporters tend to emphasize the setting, the recent history of the two teams' experience, and other contextual factors. Culture and the fundamental attribution error. Is it reasonable to assume that the fundamental attribution error occurs in all cultures? After all, nearly everyone wishes to live in a just world. Other people and their dispositions are everywhere more salient than the situation, and therefore capture attention more readily than the situation. And all people have the same basic cognitive machinery. The error does indeed seem widespread. For example, the finding that people assume that a speech or an essay by another person represents that person's own opinion on the topic, even when the position advocated in the speech or essay was assigned, has been demonstrated in many societies, including China and Japan. There is evidence, however, that the fundamental attribution error is more widespread and pronounced for Westerners than for Easterners. Westerners pay little attention to situational factors in circumstances in which Asians pay considerable attention to them and grant their influence. Consider the results of studies in which students inferred that a person who was required to express certain beliefs actually held those beliefs. 1967. Koreans make the same error as Americans when they read essays written by other people, but in the variation of this paradigm, participants themselves had to write an essay favoring a position specified by the experimenter before seeing someone else write a similar essay. 1998. With this direct experience of being required to advocate a particular position, Koreans recognized how powerful the situation was and therefore made no assumption about the attitudes of a target individual they subsequently observed. American participants, in contrast, learned nothing from the experience of being pressured to write what they did. They were just as likely as control participants to assume that the coerced targets believed what they said. Koreans are also more likely to appreciate the implications of consensus information. They recognize that if many people behave in a particular way in a given situation, then the situation is probably the main determinant of behavior. Americans' attributions tend to be less influenced by consensus information. Finally, there is evidence that Asians are less likely to make an initial dispositional inference in circumstances where such inferences are made by the great majority of Westerners. Na and Kitayama, 2011, presented participants with information about a person that could be expected to lead them to make an inference about the person's personality. For example, the statement, "She checked twice to see if the gas was on in the stove before she left," might lead a participant to infer that the person was careful. When participants were later shown a picture of the person along with the word reckless, the American participants exhibited a pattern of brain activity associated with surprise, but the Korean participants did not. Thus, Asians are not just more likely to notice situational cues that might correct a dispositional inference, they might also be less likely to make a dispositional inference in the first place. There are also differences in attributional tendencies among American subcultures. Puerto Rican children use fewer traits when describing themselves than Anglo-American children, 1986, and they are less likely to use traits to describe other people's behavior, 1991. Zaret, Ullman, and Voiles, 2001, found that Mexican Americans and Mexicans were also less likely than Anglo-Americans to make trait inferences.